a devoted pastor, a flourishing church, a woman who stood by his side. From the outside, it looked like a life blessed beyond measure. But behind closed doors, a storm was waiting to break. And when it did, the cost was paid in blood. Before his name was splashed across headlines, before the whispers of scandal and betrayal, Mark Andrew was a man people looked up to. A leader, a shepherd, a voice of hope in a world that often felt hopeless. This is the story of Pastor Mark Andrew, a man revered by his congregation, trusted by his followers, and bound by faith. But in a single moment of betrayal, that faith shattered. What could drive a man of God to commit the ultimate sin? Was it love? Was it rage? Or was it the one thing no one ever saw coming? Welcome to True Crime IQ. Thank you, my dedicated viewers, for your support. Thank you for subscribing and joining me on this journey as we explore the dark and complex stories that challenge our perceptions of trust, love, and betrayal. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an update on our latest compelling narratives. Stay tuned. Pastor Mark Andrew wasn't just a preacher, he was a force. When he spoke, people listened. His sermons weren't just words, they were fire, passion, conviction. He had a way of making the scripture come alive, making you feel like God himself was speaking through him. And maybe for a time he believed that too. God's Vineyard Fellowship wasn't just another church, it was his life's work. From a small gathering in Jacksonville, Florida, to a rented hall to a mega church that filled every seat, Mark built it from the ground up. The people who walked through those doors weren't just members, they were his flock, and he led them with authority, with unwavering confidence, with the kind of presence that made you trust him without question. He was respected, admired, almost untouchable. But for all his wisdom, for all his devotion, there was one truth Mark never saw coming. No man, no matter how powerful, is immune to his own weaknesses. Behind every great man is a great woman, and for Mark Andrew, that woman was Laura. Laura wasn't just a pastor's wife. She was the quiet force that held everything together. The kind of woman who could run an entire church event, make it look effortless, and still have dinner on the table by 6. She knew every church member by name, remembered their birthdays, their kids' names, even their prayer requests from months ago. She was the heart of God's Vineyard Fellowship, the woman who made sure things ran smoothly, while her husband stood at the pulpit, preaching about faith, love, and devotion. But Laura knew a thing or two about devotion. She had spent years pouring herself into the church, into her marriage, into the perfect image of what a pastor's wife should be. She smiled when she was supposed to, spoke when it was expected, and knew exactly when to fade into the background. And for a long time, that was enough. She had met Mark when they were both just kids with big dreams. Back then, he wasn't Pastor Mark. He was just a young man with ambition, a fire in his belly, and a way with words that made you believe in anything he said. And Laura, she was the one who stood beside him when they had nothing. When their first church service was in a cramped community center with folding chairs and a borrowed microphone. When their prayers for growth were whispered late at night in a tiny apartment where the walls were too thin and the dreams were too big. But then, those dreams came true. And somewhere between the small gatherings and the packed Sunday services, between the intimate Bible studies and the televised sermons, Laura felt herself getting smaller. It happened slowly, so slowly that she barely noticed at first. Mark became Pastor Marks to everyone, including her. His world expanded, but hers seemed to shrink. He was the man everyone wanted to speak to after service, the one whose name was known in circles far beyond their congregation. And Laura was the one who made sure the coffee was hot, the choir robes were ironed, and the visiting pastors were taken care of. She would stand in the back of the sanctuary and watch him, watch the way he commanded a room, the way people hung on to every word. He was magnetic, powerful, impossible to ignore. And sometimes, just sometimes, she wondered if he even saw her anymore. She had given up a lot for this life, a career, friendships, even her own voice, in some ways. And for what? To sit in the front row every Sunday, nodding along, while the man she had built a life with became a stranger to her. Laura wasn't bitter. No, bitterness was too easy. She was just tired, tired of being the woman people greeted politely, but never truly saw. Tired of feeling like an accessory to Mark's success. Tired of being alone in a crowded room. And when a woman feels alone for too long, eventually, someone will notice. And who else would notice aside from the church's charmer, Pastor Derek Timothy, a man with a warm smile, a steady voice, and an undeniable presence. He was the kind of preacher who didn't just speak, he connected. A man who knew when to listen, when to nod, and when to say exactly the right thing to make you feel like the most important person in the room. Derek wasn't just another pastor in the church, he was different. While others focused on fire and brimstone, on rules and righteousness, Derek preached about grace, about love, about understanding. His sermons weren't just words, they were conversations, and when he spoke, people felt heard, understood, safe. But if there was one thing Derek Timothy excelled at, it was making people feel seen, especially women. Women in pain, women who felt ignored, women who had spent too long standing in the background, waiting for anyone to notice them. And Laura was no different. At first, it was nothing more than kindness, a passing conversation after service, a word of encouragement here and there. But Derek had a way of making you linger just a little longer, of making you feel like you weren't just another face in the congregation. He noticed things. The way your smile didn't quite reach your eyes, the hesitation in your voice when you said, "I'm fine," and he always offered a listening ear. He told Laura she was remarkable, but her efforts hadn't gone unnoticed, that she was more than just the pastor's wife. She was the backbone of the church. And when someone has spent years feeling invisible, those words can feel like water to a dying plant. At first, it was harmless, a few conversations, a few extra moments after service, a shared laugh over something trivial. But then, it wasn't. It was the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the way he always seemed to be there when she needed someone, the way he understood her in a way she wasn't sure Mark ever had. And before she even realized what was happening, something shifted. A stolen moment here, a lingering glance there, a connection neither of them dared to name. And then it happened. Pastor Mark Andrew trusted his wife. He trusted his minister. He trusted the sacred bond of marriage, the brotherhood of faith, the vows that were meant to be unbreakable. But trust is a fragile thing. It takes years to build, moments to destroy. That night, Mark wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't searching for betrayal. He had just wrapped up a counseling session with a young couple struggling to hold their marriage together. He had spoken to them about patience, about love, about faith. And as he stepped out of the church, he had no idea that his own marriage was already in ruins. Laura had told him she would be coming by later. She always did. It was routine. But something about the evening felt different. A restlessness crawled beneath his skin as he made his way down the quiet hall. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something else. As he approached Pastor Derek's office, he hesitated. It was a simple task: drop off the keys and go home. But then he heard it. A voice, soft, familiar. His wife's voice. That didn't make sense. She always came to see him first. Always. He told himself he must have misheard. He took a step forward. His heart thumped against his ribs. Another step. And then, a sound that made his blood run cold. A moan. Low. Soft. Then her voice again. But this time, it wasn't just words. It was an echo of something intimate, something personal. A phrase meant for him, and him alone. You had me thirsty for you, that I couldn't wait for you to fill me. The air in his lungs vanished. His body froze, but his mind raced. There had to be another explanation. A misunderstanding. A mistake. Anything but what it sounded like. His fingers hovered over the doorknob. His hand trembled. He wanted to turn away, to walk out of the church, and pretend he never heard it. But the moment his palm touched the cool metal, the sound came again. Another moan. Another voice. Derek. Something inside him snapped. The floor beneath him felt unsteady, like the whole world had shifted. His ears rang, his vision blurred. His wife, his friend, right there. On the other side of that door. Mark took a step back, then another. He forced himself to move, to breathe. His legs carried him down the hall, past the pews, past the altar where he had stood so many times, preaching about love, about commitment, about forgiveness. But tonight, there would be no forgiveness. His office door swung open with a force that rattled the walls. His gun sat in the drawer, locked away for emergencies. He had never needed it before. But tonight was different. His grip was firm as he walked back down that hallway, back to the office where his marriage had just ended. He didn't knock, he didn't pause. He kicked the door open, and there they were. His wife, bent over, just like she had been for him. But this time, it wasn't him behind her. For a moment, no one moved. Laura's eyes went wide. Derek's mouth opened, but no words came. Mark raised the gun. 6 shots, fired in quick succession. A scream, a body, hitting the floor, then another, and then silence. Mark lowered the gun. His breathing was steady. His hands, still. The only thing he heard now was his own voice, cold and final. You both can have the next round in hell. Outside, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Someone had heard the shots. Someone had called the police. By the time the officers arrived, Mark Andrew was standing exactly where they had left him. His gun hung at his side. His face was unreadable. His world had ended. And yet, he stood there, calm. The officers shouted at him to drop the weapon. He obeyed. They ordered him to raise his hands. He did. And as they took him away, past the blood-stained floor, past the office where it had all happened, past the altar where he had once preached about grace and redemption, Mark Andrew didn't say a single word, because there was nothing left to say. The trial of Pastor Mark Andrew was more than just a courtroom battle. It was a spectacle, a storm of emotions, a reckoning that had the entire country on edge. News anchors dissected every argument. Talk shows debated his fate, and congregations across the nation whispered prayers, some for his redemption, others for his damnation. A pastor had murdered his wife and his colleague in cold blood. That much was undeniable. But was he a man who had simply been pushed too far, or was he a hypocrite hiding behind the cloth? That was the question, and both sides came prepared to answer it. The prosecution wasted no time. From the moment they stood before the jury, they painted a picture of a man who had lost control, a man who had stood on the pulpit week after week preaching forgiveness, yet when faced with betrayal had chosen to play God instead. Pastor Mark Andrew is no different from the criminals he once counseled in prison ministries, the prosecutor declared, his voice sharp as a blade. He did not seek justice. He did not turn to his God for guidance. No, he picked up a gun, and in an act of pure rage, he executed 2 people in cold blood. The words stung. They echoed through the courtroom like a sermon from the other side of morality. The prosecutor paced in front of the jury, his expression one of calculated disgust. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we must ask ourselves, if this man had been a stranger, if he had been a jealous husband with no pulpit to stand on, would we be asking whether he was a broken man, or would we simply call him what he is? A murderer. Mark sat still, his hands clasped together, his jaw locked. He did not react, but the weight of the words settled heavy in the room. Then, it was the defense's turn. Mark's attorney stood, adjusting his tie, walking toward the jury with slow, deliberate steps. His voice was steady, but beneath it was something raw, something personal. How far can a man be pushed before he breaks? He asked, his eyes scanning the jury. How much betrayal, humiliation and pain can one heart endure before it shatters beyond repair? He took a breath, letting the question settle. Mark Andrew is not a violent man. He has spent his entire life guiding others away from violence. He has counseled addicts, comforted grieving families, and lifted broken souls. But on that night, in that moment, he was not a pastor. He was a man who walked into a room expecting to find trust and found betrayal instead. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the judge seemed to lean in slightly. Now the prosecution wants you to believe that he walked in there, gun in hand, intent on taking lives. But I ask you, what would you have done? His voice rose slightly. A challenge, a plea. You go to your best friend's office, expecting nothing but the usual, and you hear your wife moaning his name. You hear her speak the very words she once whispered to you, but now they are for another man. You open that door, and the image before you is one that will haunt you for the rest of your life. A woman you have loved, honored and sacrificed for, betraying you in the most intimate way. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Someone in the back sniffled. The defense lawyer turned back to the jury. Mark Andrew did not set out to kill. His reaction was not premeditated. It was not calculated. It was the breaking point of a man who had given everything, and had it all thrown back in his face. The prosecution scoffed. So what are you saying? The prosecutor snapped, stepping forward. That any man who catches his wife cheating has the right to murder her. That we should let him walk free because his feelings were hurt. The defense attorney's jaw tightened. I am saying that this was a crime of passion. A reaction, not an execution. There is a difference. A difference, the prosecutor shot back, voice rising. Tell that to Laura Andrew. Tell that to Pastor Derek Timothy. Tell that to their families. Tell that to their bodies lying in a morgue with 6 bullets inside them. The room tensed. The defense lawyer inhaled, slow and deep. Mark Andrew is guilty of something. Yes, but not cold-blooded murder. This was not a man plotting revenge. This was a man who walked into a moment that shattered his entire existence in the blink of an eye. And the law, your law, acknowledges that there is a difference between calculated murder and an uncontrollable act of passion. The jury watched, some nodding slightly, others expressionless. Then, Mark himself was called to the stand. He walked up slowly, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked out at the faces staring back at him. The judge, the lawyers, the jury, the reporters scribbling furiously, the cameras flashing. His voice was quiet but firm. I did not wake up that morning, planning to kill my wife. I did not go looking for pain, but I found it anyway. And when I saw them, he swallowed hard, closing his eyes for a brief moment before continuing. But something inside me broke. I was not a pastor in that moment. I was not a leader. I was a man who loved a woman who did not love him back. A pause. I regret what I did, but I cannot take it back. I can only carry it, and I will carry it, for the rest of my life. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, the judge gave the jury their instructions. The fate of Mark Andrew was no longer in his hands. It was in theirs. For 2 days, the nation waited. 2 days of debate, of arguments behind closed doors. 2 days of questions. Was it murder? Was it a moment of madness? Did a man deserve to spend the rest of his life in a prison cell for one act of uncontrollable emotion? And then, the verdict. The courtroom was packed when the jury filed back in. Every breath held, every movement stilled. We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Andrew, guilty of second-degree murder. A cry rang out from the back. A woman sobbed. Mark's face remained unreadable. The judge's voice was heavy, deliberate. Mark Andrew, you are hereby sentenced to 35 years in prison, no parole. And just like that, it was over. The gavel struck. The murmurs swelled. The cameras flashed. Mark Andrew was led away, hands bound in cuffs, the weight of his actions shackled to his soul. A pastor, a husband, a man, once a leader of thousands, now a prisoner of his own choices. God's Vineyard Fellowship never stood a chance. A church once filled with worshippers, once bursting with song and prayer, was now nothing more than an abandoned relic of a broken past. The pews sat empty. The pulpit that once held a man preaching faith and redemption now gathered dust, its silence speaking louder than any sermon ever had. The congregation that once clung to every word he spoke scattered like leaves in the wind, unwilling to stand beneath the weight of his shame. It's strange how quickly people forget the good when the bad comes rushing in. Mark had built that church from the ground up. He had married people at its altar, baptized their children, comforted them in times of loss. Yet in the end, his name was whispered with disgust. spoken only in hushed conversations behind closed doors. He was no longer Pastor Mark, he was the man who had let rage consume him, the man who had allowed betrayal to turn him into a murderer. And Laura, some say she deserved what she got, others say no one deserves to die like that. But the real question lingers. How much responsibility did she bear in the unraveling of everything? She had stood beside Mark for years, playing the role of a devoted wife. But how long had it been an act? How long had she been slipping away, one stolen moment at a time, into the arms of another man? Marriage isn't perfect. No one gets everything they want. But does that justify betrayal? Should a wife seek comfort in another man when her own husband fails to meet her needs? Or should she fight for what she vowed to uphold? And if she does betray, what then? Should a man simply swallow his pain, walk away, and let it fester in silence? Or does there come a point where even the strongest of men shatter under the weight of their own heartbreak? Mark didn't walk away. He couldn't. He let his emotions speak louder than his faith, and in that one moment of rage, he destroyed everything he had spent a lifetime building. 1 second, one choice. And now, the man who once preached forgiveness sat behind prison walls, left to contemplate whether he had ever truly believed his own words. Prison became his new pulpit, but the message was different. Now, he no longer spoke of a God who lifted the broken. He spoke of choices, of regret, of the thin line between righteousness and ruin. He had nothing left but time, and he used it to warn others, to tell men like him that anger is a thief, that vengeance does not heal, that no amount of pain justifies taking another life. But can a man truly repent when the blood on his hands will never wash away? Can he ever be redeemed when the world will never see him as anything more than a killer? Some believe justice was served, others say he was simply a man who lost his way. And now I ask you, if you had walked into that room and seen the love of your life betraying you in the worst possible way, what would you have done? Would you have turned the other cheek, left with dignity, and let the pain hollow you from the inside? Or would you have seen red, let the rage take over, and done something you could never undo? And what about Laura? Was she truly a victim, or did she help set fire to the house she once called home? Should a wife respect the vows she made, even when she's unhappy? Or do vows lose meaning when love begins to fade? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you found it intense and thought-provoking, and subscribe to True Crime IQ for more gripping tales like this. Join the community, hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and we'll see you in our next video.